This is a fictional romantic story created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and organizations are purely imaginary. Have you ever shown up somewhere, a party, a wedding, a room full of people who knew you before, and brought an entire performance with you, just to prove you were fine? Just to make one person believe the story you hadn't even convinced yourself of yet? That's where this story begins. With a woman who planned everything perfectly, except the man she brought. If this sounds like something you need to hear today, get comfortable, because this one is going to stay with you. Drop a like if you can. We're aiming for 250 on this episode, and we'd love your help getting there. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from right now? We read every single one. If you're new here, hit follow. You found the right channel. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, printed on cream cardstock with gold lettering, and Valentina Cruz had held it over her kitchen sink for a full 30 seconds before deciding not to burn it. She went instead. That decision said more about her than she liked to admit. Newport, Rhode Island, in late August, carried itself like a city that had never needed to try. The mansion sat behind iron gates and old hedgerows. The harbor smelled of salt and diesel and money, and the kind of wedding Daniel Rourke was throwing. 300 guests, a converted Gilded Age estate overlooking the water, a string quartet for the cocktail hour, required exactly the kind of entrance Valentina had spent 2 weeks engineering and one panicked night destroying entirely. The original plan had been simple. Arrive composed, look devastating, say nothing that mattered. The revised plan had been humiliating to conceive, and was currently standing in the hallway of the Vanderbilt Hotel, looking at her. His name, according to the agency confirmation she'd received at 11 the previous night, was Marco. He had a profile photo, a rate card, and a 5-star review from a client in Boston who described him as utterly convincing. Valentina had read the review 3 times, told herself she was a rational adult, making a rational choice, and booked him with the same emotional detachment she used when ordering catering equipment for events she'd rather not attend. The man in the hallway was not Marco. Or rather, he might have been using that name. But Marco suggested something approachable, something performative, something hired. The man outside her door was none of those things. He was over 6 feet, built through the chest and shoulders in a way that a suit could barely negotiate, and he wore the dark jacket like it was the least interesting thing about him. His forearms, where the sleeves were rolled once at the cuff, showed ink. Geometric and deliberate, the kind of tattoos that didn't announce themselves. His jaw was clean-shaved. His eyes, when they found hers, were the color of deep water, and they did not move with the casual, salesman warmth she had been expecting. He looked at her, the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. "Ms. Cruz?" he said. Not a question. "You're late," Valentina said, because it was true and because it was the only sentence she had ready. Traffic from Providence. He glanced past her into the room, a single sweep, then back to her face. "Are we going over the story before we arrive, or would you prefer to build it as we go?" She stepped back and let him in, which she would later understand was the first of several decisions she made without fully thinking them through. His name, for the weekend, was Mateo, her fiancé of 8 months. They had met in Miami through a mutual friend. She had the friend's name ready, a woman who'd moved to Barcelona and couldn't be easily fact-checked. He was in private investment. They were not yet living together. He was the kind of man she had chosen after a long period of choosing badly. That last part, she hadn't invented. He listened to everything she told him without interrupting. He asked 2 questions. Whether Daniel knew her well enough to test the details, and whether there was anyone at the wedding who might recognize him. The second question she hadn't thought to ask herself, and the fact that he had told her something she couldn't name yet. That this man was not operating on the same level of social performance she was. "Why would someone recognize you?" she asked. "Old clients," he said, and offered nothing else. She almost pushed. She didn't, because the car she'd arranged was already waiting downstairs, and because she told herself it wasn't her business. She was paying for a performance, not a confession. What she didn't know, stepping into the elevator beside him, was that Mateo Reyes had not come to Newport for her. He had come because Harlan Briggs, Daniel Rourke's new father-in-law, the man currently hosting 300 people at his estate on Bellevue Avenue, owed the Reyes organization a debt that had been accumulating interest for 4 years. It was not a financial debt, though it had begun as one. It had become something more complicated, the kind of obligation that required a conversation in person, and a context in which Harlan Briggs could not simply leave the room. A wedding was perfect. A man attending a wedding with a beautiful woman on his arm was invisible in a way a man arriving alone was not. When Valentina Cruz's booking came through the agency, a legitimate front, one of several Mateo maintained for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, it had landed on his desk because the name Rourke appeared in her file notes. He had read her profile with the same attention he gave intelligence reports. Event coordinator. Miami. Former relationship with the groom. Attending solo. Requested. Convincing. Presentable. Discreet. He had decided to handle it personally. That decision, he would later find more difficult to explain than he usually allowed. The estate sat back from the road behind a long gravel drive lined with white hydrangeas, and the late afternoon light turned the stone facade the color of warm sand. Valentina saw it through the car window and felt something old and familiar move through her chest. The particular grief of watching a life you once imagined for yourself get dressed up for someone else. She had been with Daniel for 2 years. He had ended it in a text message, not even a long one. Mateo, seated beside her, said nothing. But she noticed that he had turned slightly in his seat, so that he could see her face, and that he watched her expression with a precision she wasn't ready for. "I'm fine," she said, though he hadn't asked. "I know," he said, which was worse somehow than sympathy would have been. They arrived. A valet opened the door. Mateo stepped out first, offered his hand, and when she took it, she registered, distantly, behind all the performance she was managing, that his hand was very warm, and that he held hers not like a prop, but like something he'd decided to keep for a moment. They walked toward the entrance together, 300 people inside, her ex-boyfriend about to marry someone else. A man beside her whose name she barely knew, and whose stillness she was beginning to understand was not peace. It was control. The kind that comes from never needing to raise your voice because the room already knows what you are. 2 steps from the door, she felt his hand shift to the small of her back. A light, steady pressure. And she heard him say, close to her ear, "Smile like you won." She did. And the terrible thing was, standing next to him, it almost felt true. The cocktail hour unfolded the way these things always did when old money was involved. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of elegance that was really just a more expensive form of pressure. Waiters moved through the crowd with champagne flutes and chilled shrimp. The string quartet played something European and unthreatening, and the guests arranged themselves into the careful hierarchies that weddings always revealed. Valentina had coordinated events like this for 8 years. She knew every social current in a room like this, every slight disguised as a compliment, every smile that meant the opposite of warmth. She was good at reading rooms. It was, in fact, the thing she was best at. She was not good, she discovered in the first 20 minutes, at reading Mateo Reyes. He played the role. That much she could confirm. He kept his hand near her, sometimes at her waist, sometimes brushing her arm in a way that was entirely credible. And when anyone spoke to him, he answered with the kind of quiet confidence that made people feel they had asked the right question. He called her Val without being told to, which was what Daniel had always called her. And the first time she heard it from his mouth, she felt something sharp and complicated move through her before she caught herself. Daniel found them near the terrace. He looked well. He always had. That particular kind of well-groomed, well-intentioned, well-resourced ease that Valentina had once found attractive, and now recognized as the surface of something fundamentally shallow. He was with his bride, a quiet, pretty woman named Cecily, who seemed genuinely kind and completely unaware of the architecture of tension surrounding the moment. "Val," Daniel said. He hugged her. She let him. "I'm glad you came, really." "Congratulations," she said, and meant approximately half of it. His eyes moved to Matteo with the particular sharpness of a man assessing a threat he doesn't want to acknowledge as a threat. "And this is—" "Matteo," Matteo said, extending his hand. His grip, Valentina noticed, was not aggressive. It was simply final, the kind of handshake that communicated without effort that the conversation about dominance was already over. "Great. Wow. How long have you two—" "8 months, Valentina said. 8 months, Daniel repeated, with a tone she recognized, the tone of a man recalculating. Cecily smiled warmly and said something about being glad Valentina was there, and the four of them talked for 4 minutes about nothing. And then Daniel and Cecily moved on, and Valentina exhaled slowly through her nose and did not look at Matteo because she didn't trust what her face was doing. "You're shaking," he said quietly. "I'm not." "Your left hand is." He said it without cruelty, without performance, just observation. "Do you want to step outside?" She did. They did. The terrace looked over a long lawn that ran down toward the harbor, and the sun was low enough now to turn the water copper and gold. Valentina stood at the stone railing and breathed in salt air, and told herself that she was a professional, a grown woman, a person who had chosen to come to this wedding and chosen to arrive with a stranger, and that she was going to survive the next 6 hours with her dignity intact. "He texted you," Matteo said. It wasn't a question. She turned to look at him. "How do you—" "The way you held your phone at the bar when you thought I wasn't looking." He leaned against the railing beside her, not crowding her, just present. "You don't have to explain it." "I wasn't going to." A pause. The water gleamed below them. "He left me by text," she said, because apparently she was going to explain it. "We had been together for 2 years. I had a drawer at his apartment. I had opinions about his kitchen, and he texted me." She stopped. "That's not something you don't just move past that without it changing something about what you believe people are capable of." Matteo looked at the water. "No," he said, "you don't." The simplicity of it surprised her. She had expected something, a reassurance, a deflection, the kind of comfortable nothing that men offered when they didn't know what else to do. What she got instead was a man who simply agreed with her, without trying to fix her, and somehow that was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. She looked at him sidelong. The last light caught the edge of his jaw, the ink at his collar. "What exactly do you invest in?" she asked. "Privately." His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something near it. "Risk management." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Inside, behind the tall windows, she could see the reception hall filling. And then she saw something that changed the texture of the evening. Harlan Briggs, Cecily's father, a broad, silver-haired man with the smile of someone accustomed to being pleased, stopped in the middle of a conversation, turned slowly toward the terrace, and found Matteo's face through the glass with an expression that had nothing to do with wedding joy. It was recognition, and beneath it, something that looked distinctly like fear. Matteo saw it too. She felt the shift in him, not panic, not urgency, something colder and more deliberate than either. His posture changed in a way she couldn't fully describe. The same stillness, but loaded now, the way silence is different before a storm. "What was that?" she asked. An old acquaintance, he said. He looks like he's seen a ghost. He's seen a reminder, Matteo said quietly. There's a difference. She understood then. Not the specifics, not the debt. Not the Rhea's name or what it meant on the eastern seaboard, but the shape of the thing. The understanding that the man beside her had not arrived at this wedding by coincidence. That she was not the reason he was here, or at least had not been, at the beginning. The realization should have made her angry. It did make her angry. A clean, righteous spike of fury at being used as cover, at her pain being leveraged, at herself for not seeing it sooner. But there was a second realization, slower and more complicated, that arrived behind the first. He had not had to be kind to her. He had not had to notice her shaking hand, or come outside, or listen to the story about the text message. None of that was in any rate card. None of that was performance. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. I think, she said carefully, that you owe me a real conversation. I think you're right, he said. And the way he said it, without deflection, without charm, with something that felt almost like relief, was the thing that stopped her from walking back inside alone. Later, when the dancing started and the chandeliers scattered gold light across 300 people, pretending the world outside didn't exist, Matteo led her onto the floor because it was expected, because it was cover, and also, though neither of them said this, because neither of them moved to stop it. He held her properly. One hand at her waist, the other holding hers, and they moved through the slow music, with the kind of attention people give to things they are trying very hard not to want. She could feel the warmth of him through the fabric of his jacket. She could feel that he was not performing this part. Daniel watched from across the room with an expression she'd spent 2 years trying to earn. She stopped thinking about Daniel entirely. Your name isn't Marco, she said, against his shoulder. No, he said. Are you going to tell me your actual name? A beat. The music moved around them. Matteo, he said. That part was always true. It should not have been enough. It was, somehow, a beginning. Across the room, Harlan Briggs excused himself from a conversation and moved toward the exit with the specific urgency of a man who has just remembered something urgent. Matteo watched him go. His jaw tightened once. Tomorrow, he thought. Tonight was still tonight. His hand at Valentina's waist did not move. She found out his name the way she found out most important things. By accident, at the wrong moment, when she was already too far in to pretend it didn't matter. It was past midnight. The reception had wound down to its final hour, the speeches done, the cake cut, the older guests cycling toward the exit with coats and gracious goodbyes. Valentina had stepped away from the ballroom to find a quiet corridor, a moment of air, and had nearly walked into a conversation that stopped the moment it saw her. 2 men she didn't recognize, and Harlan Briggs, his face the color of old wax. Ms. Cruz, Harlan said, which meant he had looked her up since the terrace. One of the men, younger, with a phone already in his hand, said something in a low voice that she caught only the edge of. Reyes doesn't belong here. If he's here because of you. He's my fiancé, Valentina said, because it was the only card she had. The younger man looked at her with the particular contempt of someone who believes they are smarter than the room. Mateo Reyes, he said, the name landing like a stone in still water, is not anyone's fiancé. He is the reason 3 families in this city sleep with lawyers on retainer. You should think carefully about what it means to be attached to that name in a place like this. Harlan put a hand on the younger man's arm. A warning. Valentina held the man's gaze and said nothing, which was, she would realize later, the thing that Matteo had somehow already taught her to do. The stillness, the refusal to answer pressure with panic. She walked away. Down the corridor, through a service door that led to a side terrace, and she stood alone above the harbor in the dark with the name Mateo Reyes settling over her like weather. She knew what it meant. She was not naive. She had coordinated events for clients who moved in rooms adjacent to that kind of power, and she understood the architecture of fear that a name like that carried. She also understood that she had spent the last 8 hours beside him, that he had noticed her shaking hand, that he had said no when she offered him a simpler kind of honesty than he could have used. None of that excused what he was. None of it changed what she felt, which was the more inconvenient problem. He found her 10 minutes later. Of course he did. She had come to understand that Mateo Reyes knew where things were at all times, and she had apparently become one of those things. "You heard something," he said. "I heard your name." He came to stand beside her at the railing, not in front of her, not blocking her, just beside. The harbor below was dark and quiet, and the party inside was a distant hum. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't perform regret. He simply stood with the weight of what he was, and waited. "You used me," she said. "You needed a reason to be at this wedding, and I handed you one." "Yes," he said. The honesty of it was almost violent. "Is that all you're going to say?" "I could explain the rest," he said, "but I don't think that's what you're asking." She turned to look at him. In the dark, his face was unguarded in a way it hadn't been inside, under the chandeliers with Harlan Briggs watching from across the room. The control was still there. It was structural, part of who he was, not a performance he could switch off. But beneath it, something she hadn't seen clearly before was visible now. A man who had made a calculated decision and discovered, somewhere between the terrace and the dance floor, that the calculation had become personal. "What I'm asking," she said slowly, "is whether any of tonight was real." A long pause. The water moved below them. "The conversation on the terrace," he said. "The dance. The part where I stopped thinking about Harlan Briggs." He held her gaze. "Those were real." There was a sound behind them, the service door opening, footsteps, and then one of Harlan's men came through it with the kind of momentum that meant the polite portion of the evening was over. He stopped when he saw Mateo, and the calculation on his face was fast and unhappy. "Mr. Reyes, Mr. Briggs would like a word." "I know," Mateo said. He glanced at Valentina. Something passed across his face. Not apology exactly, but acknowledgement. "Give us a moment." The man retreated through the door. Mateo turned back to her fully. "What happens now?" she asked. "I'm going to speak with Harlan Briggs," he said, "and resolve something that's been unresolved for too long. And then I'm going to take you back to your hotel." He paused. "You don't have to be involved in what happens inside." "I'm already involved. You made me involved." "I know." The words were quiet and carried real weight. "I won't pretend otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. 36 hours ago, she had been in Miami, telling herself that showing up to her ex-boyfriend's wedding with a hired stranger was a reasonable act of self-preservation. The story had changed so far beyond that premise that she could barely see the starting point from where she was standing. And yet, standing here, above the harbor, in the dark, with this man, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safe, exactly. The situation was too electric for safe. But seen, present inside her own life, rather than performing around the edges of it. "Go talk to Harlan," she said. He held her gaze one moment longer, then went inside. She waited. She did not leave. Whatever passed between Mateo Reyes and Harlan Briggs in the private room off the East Corridor, she did not witness, and he did not detail. What she observed was that when Mateo came back to her 40 minutes later, his expression had the particular stillness of a closed account. Harlan Briggs did not appear again for the rest of the evening. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, a different kind of quiet than the drive down. "You could have told me," she said, not with accusation, as a statement of fact. "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He considered the question the way he considered most things, seriously, without performance. "Because I thought you'd leave, and I needed the cover." A pause. "And then because I didn't want you to leave. The second reason replaced the first, and I didn't handle the transition well." Valentina looked out at the dark road, the headlights cutting through the coastal night. "That might be the most honest thing a man has said to me in 2 years," she said. "I don't have a use for dishonesty with you," he said simply. "You're too perceptive for it." She laughed, genuine, short, surprised out of her. He glanced at her, and the line of his mouth moved into something that was, unmistakably, a real smile. It changed his face entirely, made him look like a man who had been withholding something good for a very long time. They sat in the hotel bar until 2 a.m. No performance. No rate card. No cover story. He told her enough. Not everything, but enough. And she listened with the same precision she'd used on other people's events her whole career, finally turning it on something that mattered to her. She understood who he was. She was not under any illusion that his world was clean. But she understood the difference between a man who wielded power carelessly and a man who carried it with the particular exhaustion of someone who had inherited it and chosen, at some point, to be worthy of it rather than merely protected by it. She was not reckless. She did not fall into anything that night. What she did was say, when they finally stood to go, "Give me your actual number, not the agency." He did. She did not call it for 4 days, which she spent back in Miami sitting with the reality of what she was considering, looking at it from every angle, asking herself whether she was making a decision or escaping into one. She had spent 2 years with a man who texted her goodbye. She was not going to run toward danger for the relief of feeling something. But on the 4th day, she called, and he answered on the 2nd ring, and the first thing he said was, "I wondered if it would be 4 days or 5. "You were counting?" she said. "I was," he said. No apology. "I want to understand what a life near yours actually looks like," she said. "Not the version that keeps me comfortable. The real version." "It's complicated," he said. "I coordinate 300-person events for a living," she said. "I can manage complicated." A silence. And then that real smile again, audible even through a phone, the one she'd seen only once, at 2 a.m, when all the performance had finally run out. "Then let me take you to dinner," he said. "Somewhere that isn't a wedding." She smiled too, alone in her apartment in Miami, salt air through the window, the cream cardstock invitation long since thrown away. "Somewhere I won't need a cover story," she said. "No cover stories," he agreed. "Just us." It was not a fairy tale. It was not the uncomplicated love she might have chosen if she were building a life from scratch with no history and no damage, and no understanding of what the world actually contained. It was harder than that, and more real than that, and for exactly that reason, more hers than anything she had performed her way through in the previous 2 years. She did not need rescuing. She had gone to Newport to rescue her own dignity, and she had done that, though not in any way she had planned. What she had found instead was a man who had not tried to fix her, had not offered her comfort she hadn't earned, had not pretended the world between them was simple. He had simply told the truth when it cost him something. That, she had decided, was enough to begin with. Valentina Cruz went to that wedding to protect something. The version of herself that wasn't broken. The woman who could walk into a room and make it believe she had moved on. She brought a stranger to hold that version in place. She didn't know the stranger would see through it on a terrace above the harbor before the sun had even finished setting. There is something quietly devastating about the way we perform healing for people who no longer deserve our pain. We choose the outfit, rehearse the expression, arrange the narrative, all for an audience that stopped watching years ago. And somewhere in the performance, we forget that the person most changed by it is ourselves. Valentina walked into that estate armed with a story. She walked out carrying something she hadn't budgeted for. The experience of being witnessed without the performance, by someone who had no obligation to offer it. That is its own kind of danger. Not the kind that comes from power or reputation, or the fear in Harlan Briggs's eyes. The kind that comes from being truly seen at the moment you are most committed to being invisible. The question this story leaves behind is not whether she made the right choice. The question is whether you have ever shown up somewhere as a performance and been undone by someone who refused to watch the show. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us. Would you have called back? Or would the truth of who he was have been too much to walk toward, no matter how real the dance felt? Share this story with someone who has ever dressed up their pain and called it moving on. And if you haven't found this channel yet, you're in the right place now.